Before I start my homily, I just want to say it was good, Don, to see you back behind the ambo again. It's been a long time since you've been able to do that, and your reading is just as clear as ever, so thank you. Last weekend, we began reading from 3 weeks ago, we began reading from the Gospel of St. Mark. And we'll read Mark's Gospel throughout ordinary time for the rest of this church year. And so I want to begin today by kind of setting the scene, telling you a little bit about Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel was the first Gospel written, and it was written around 70 A.D., some 35 to 40 years after Jesus had died, rose, and then ascended into heaven. And one of the first things you will notice if you sit down and read Mark's Gospel from the beginning is that there's no story of Jesus' birth. There's no star in the sky, no shepherd, no angels, no census, because none of that was really important to Mark or to his listeners. What was important to Mark was who Jesus was and what he was about. And what was he about? We heard that proclaimed in last week's reading. This is the time of fulfillment. The kingdom of God is at hand. Now, I'm going to get to today's reading in just a few moments, but in order to do so, I need to spend a little more time on last week's reading. Last week's gospel has Jesus proclaiming, now is the time of fulfillment, the kingdom of God is at hand. But what exactly did Jesus mean when he spoke about the kingdom of God? What do we mean as a parish family when we say in our mission statement that we are building God's kingdom by growing disciples and making disciples through love of God and neighbor? What is God's kingdom? We hear about it a lot in the New Testament. Over 70 times in the New Testament, Jesus mentions the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. Here are just 4 of them. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. In Luke's gospel, Jesus says, for indeed the kingdom of God is within you. And Luke says, as well as Matthew and Mark, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. So you see what I mean when Jesus talked a lot about the kingdom of God. And so what are we to think when we hear that phrase, kingdom of God? Some scholars like to say that the kingdom of God is God's dream for the world. The kingdom of God is God's vision for how the world should be. And so immediately when Jesus says the kingdom of God is at hand, we should be thinking God's vision for the world is at hand. God's dream for the world is right here. And then in Mark's gospel, Jesus does 2 things that tell us a lot about what he thinks about the kingdom of God, about his dream for the world. He begins by calling the apostles. He called 3 of them last week. And then today, he works his first miracle. And those 2 events tell us a lot about God's kingdom, a lot about God's dream, a lot about God's vision. The first calls of the 12 tells us about God's dream for the world. And it's not a dream about the rich and the powerful. It's not even about church leaders, because there's not a church leader among the 12. The first that he called last week were 3 fishermen. And the closest one to being rich was Matthew, who earned his money by cheating and extorting his Jewish brothers. The calling of the 12 tells us that when you think about the kingdom of God, when you think about God's vision for the world, think of surprises. Why did Jesus choose these 12 with all their faults? Perhaps because he knew and they knew that they needed Jesus. God's kingdom, God's dream, God's vision works best for people who know they can't do it on their own, people who know they need Jesus. And then in today's gospel, he works his first miracle, at least the first one recorded by St. Mark. And in working this miracle, he tells us once again something about the kingdom of God. God's kingdom, God's vision, God's dream is a world where good triumphs over evil. The demon is there. The demon knows who Jesus is. I know who you are, the Holy One of God. But the demon has no power over Jesus. In God's kingdom, in God's vision, in God's dream for the world, good triumphs over evil. Next week, we'll hear another miracle, the miracle of Simon Peter's mother-in-law. And that too tells us about God's vision for the world. In God's vision for the world, health overcomes illness. Wholeness overcomes brokenness. And the week after that, we'll hear a third miracle story, the cleansing of a leper. And in that story, Mark tells us that Jesus is moved with pity. In God's vision for the world, in God's kingdom, genuine empathy is to be sought after. Doing good over evil is to be proclaimed. Later on in Mark's gospel, Jesus tells us that his vision for the world, that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, something that starts off small and grows incredibly large. So my friends, when we say that here at JP2, we are all about building God's kingdom, what we are saying is that we want God's dream for the world and not our own. We want God's vision for the world and not our vision. We want to be building a kingdom of God that is part of the culture of this parish. Ultimately, what that means is that we want people who choose God's ways over our ways, God's dreams over our dreams, God's kingdom over any kingdom of our own making. God's ways over our ways, God's dreams over our dreams, God's kingdom over any kingdom of our own making. Please, God, let it be so.